Good afternoon and good morning. I would like to welcome you to the Open Networks workshop about the interoperability of conversational assistants. My name is Wuttke, and I have the honor to serve the Open Voice Network as a chairman of the technical committee. In addition to this, I'm responsible for voice technologies within the Schwarz Group, and today I have the pleasure to introduce to this workshop. Before we start, this meeting is being recorded, and as always, the recording will be stored in the Open Voice Network's Google Workspace. And of course, everything happens according to the guidelines of the Linux Foundation. And Nathan, may I ask you to read the corresponding antitrust guidelines?
Linux Foundation meetings involve participation by industry competitors, and it's the intention of the Linux Foundation to conduct all of its activities in accordance with applicable antitrust and competition laws. It's therefore extremely important that attendees adhere to meeting agendas and be aware of and not participate in any activities prohibited under applicable U.S., state, federal, or foreign antitrust and competition laws. Examples of types of actions that are prohibited at Linux Foundation meetings and in connection with Linux Foundation activities are described in the Linux Foundation antitrust policy available at the link on your screen. If you have questions about these matters, please contact your company counsel, or if you're a member of the Linux Foundation, feel free to contact Andrew Updegrove of the Boston-based firm of Gesmer Updegrove LLP, which provides legal counsel to the Linux Foundation. Back to you, Christian.
Thank you so much, Nathan. So let's have a closer look at our today's agenda. We will start with the why, and then the what and when, which is basically a kind of a roadmap, followed by some documents to review, and of course, where you can find them. Shortly before we take a short break, we will focus more on the details or a deep dive in our core architecture. After a short break, we will discuss privacy and security topics and talk about finding and discovery. Following on from this, we will discuss how to move forward. And at the end, there's the afterword, which is kind of an open forum for commentary and discussion. And we are really looking for your participation here. So before we start, there are some meetings protocols for today. So please mute your microphone and submit all of your questions, your thoughts, and your comments through the Zoom chat. And just highlighting once more the afterword, please join us for an open mic discussion and discuss with us your perspective on the topic of interoperability. Starting, who are we? The Open Voice Network is a non-profit, tech-neutral community of the Linux Foundation. And what we are developing are technical standards as well as trustmark. But today, it's all about the interoperability. And what we share is a common belief, a belief that conversational AI will only reach its full potential if it's worthy of user trust. And we have to take care that this trust is somehow generated. Conversational AI, furthermore, should work like the web, should be very easy, should be customer-centric. Conversational AI developers should be able to build once and use it everywhere. We do not want to build different apps for different ecosystems. And we believe that your data is your data, and it's your choice if you want to share this data. And finally, conversational AI is, of course, for everyone. It's inclusive and accessible. So why are we all doing this? Well, because there's a tremendous need, a need for standards. So let's hand over to John Stine, and he's our executive director of the Open Voice Network, and he will lead us and take us through the why.
Nathan, if we could change slides, please. Christian, thank you very much for that introduction, and welcome everyone to this global webinar on the topic of the interoperability of conversational assistants. I'm John Stine, Executive Director of the Open Voice Network. As you can hear, I'm based in the States. And in this conversation over the next 15 minutes, we'll discuss a number of reasons why, for users, for those who work in voice, why this is important and why it's an economic issue. We'll also have the opportunity to hear from two leaders in voice and in the Open Voice Network. Mirko, Saul, Head of Digitalization and Innovations at Schwarz Digital. He's the chair of the steering committee, our board of the Open Voice Network. And then Dalloul, with a global perspective, Vice President of Azure AI at Microsoft, and also serving on our board. Nathan, next slide, please. This is, of course, an issue of technology. And it is an issue that, broadly stated, is a part of nearly every industry developed, whether it's railroad gauges, whether it is the internet. The question of standards and interoperability is largely before us. And please know, and let me make clear, we applaud all work within the larger conversational AI industry. We applaud all work toward interoperability. And there are a number of other efforts beyond the Open Voice Network. From us to those individuals and those initiatives, bravo, we're delighted. And certainly we would love to be working closely and collaboratively with those efforts. So, but yes, it's an issue of technology. Nathan, if you jump to the next slide, please. It's also an issue of standards for an emerging industry. One of the core assumptions of the Open Voice Network is that conversational AI, as it is right now, is an emerging and evolving technology. We are far from mature. We might be using the rough analogy, we might be in the browser war days of voice. We might be in the AOL days of voice, but we are not mature. And as we think about the impact of standards and standards for interoperability, we look at other models and to see the economic impact of what standards for interoperability have brought to the industry. So again, a perspective that this is for an emerging, evolving industry. And lastly, Nathan, if you would please, this is an issue of the economic and data playing field. For voice, like all digital technologies and all of digital life, is about data. And a remarkable, and you'll hear from our colleagues later in this meeting, the remarkable richness of voice data. Data is what drives economic value. And the question is if we go back, Nathan, to the prior slide, the question is, can we lift all boats? Can we create an opportunity for a level playing field for all of the voice industry, for all of the users of voice, for all the developers of voice? A level playing field, that a rising tide that lifts all boats, because ultimately this is about who makes money and how. Who makes money and how? Nathan, next slide, please. Yes, and many of you who have worked in standards efforts and have been part of those or had those touch your professional life, you know these things. There's nothing new here. But conversational assistance interoperability will open access to customers, suppliers, sources of knowledge, digital destinations of every type. Conversational assistance interoperability will level the playing field. We're all working under common, consistent rules. And the best teams, the greatest differentiation, the greatest value will win. It will open industry development. For those of you working as developers, those of you working in the industry, to build once and use many. To build once and use across all platforms, all the great platforms. To build and construct for your clients and your customers with best of breed technology. And to allow also that you to build upon standards and then invest your money not in replicating what others have done, but invest in differentiation, invest in the innovation, invest in what makes your products better. And then finally, it drives user trust. And this is the issue right now, is that do we have user trust not only, and oftentimes people see this as it's privacy. This is far greater than that. It is a voice that for all users can create value. Voice that can reach out and touch and connect with all customers, all constituents, all clients, patients, providers. Voice that drives and standards and interoperability privacy, security, authentication, standards that support that drive and enable user trust. Common, consistent rules for data protection and data respect. Next slide, please. At the heart, it's an economic issue, and I keep repeating that phrase to drive that home. Who are we doing this for? Who are the constituents for whom this is so important? Certainly, it's individual users. The ability to, for open access to reach every digital destination. It's for industry developers to create best of breed, to focus on innovation, the points I made just a moment ago. It's for enterprise content owners, building once and using everywhere. It's for the IoT smart home system and makers. We've been very influenced by the recent European Union document on the importance of and the opportunities in the IoT and smart home space and the role that voice plays in that. Unfortunately, today, as a gatekeeper, as a protector, as a stopper of opportunity for manufacturers and those creating new systems. Yes, there are standards efforts going on here, but voice remains a major issue for the IoT smart home, smart enterprise space. And then the metaverse. Those doing social gaming, those who will be using voice as an interface to move away from gatekeepers. So open access, best of breed, build once, use everywhere, and eliminating the gatekeeping to allow those who create systems to reach their constituents to reach those who create systems, and to do that in an open, very accessible, standards-based way. It's an economic issue. And that's why we're doing this, and that's why this is important. Next slide, please. Let's talk more about and meet with two individuals here and have them share their thoughts. And Mirko, I trust you're on the line. Mirko Saul is the head of digitalization and innovations at Schwartz Digital in Neckarsulm, Deutschland. He's the chair of the steering committee for the Open Voice Network. He has been involved in this project since its beginnings in 2019. Mirko, please, if you would be so kind as to share with us, why is this from your perspective? I mean, you're head of digitalization innovation of Europe's leading largest retailer in terms of revenue, stores, employees, and the like. Just tell us why this is so important to the future of voice, but to a leading retailer such as Schwartz Group, please.
So, hi everybody. Yeah, John. So for us as a large retailer, of course, we like to use standards, and as maybe a lot of you are aware of, a lot of the processes and daily activities we have in retail are based on global standards like GTIN, so having a common item number all around the world, which eases a lot of things. And the question is why this shouldn't be possible with voice, or why shouldn't it be possible to use voice as easily as we use email, so that we are not only able to send an email from an Outlook client to another Outlook client, but of course from an Outlook client to a Gmail client or to a Thunderbird client. Why this shouldn't be possible for voice. In the end, what we usually see is that everybody gets much more if they are using standard instead of building walled gardens, which are always by concept limited to a specific amount of users. And as John said, as largest retailer, I mean, we have everybody shops in our stores. And of course, we also want to offer everybody the possibility to get in touch with us via a voice assistant or a chatbot. And therefore, of course, we strongly encourage the building and the foundation of standards, because for us, that's the only way to really reach everybody without the need to build dozens of different assistants for each walled garden. And then usually all these single assistants would, of course, lack in terms of user experience. And so nobody would really profit. So neither the providers of voice assistance, we as a user, or the end users. So nobody would really like to use it, because it's always would lack the user experience if you have to develop it 3, 4, 5, or 6 times. And this is why we strongly believe that also in voice, the industry should use standards, because in the end, this would be a much better result for everybody.
Mirko, thank you. Let me turn to Ali for a moment here. And Ali, you, a global perspective, you work around the world in your position as VP for Azure AI. You've been a supporter and a staunch encourager of the Open Voice Network now for several years. Your perspective, why is this important? Why is it important to Microsoft? Why is it important to your many global clients? Please.
Yeah, good morning, John, and thank you for the opportunity, and thanks everyone on the call and in the broader teams that are working on this very important initiative. And Mirko, thank you for the great words, and good to see you again. I would just build on what Mirko said, John. I think from the early days of the founding of Microsoft and the industry broadly, one of the major disincentives to scale has been the lack of standards. Across the board. And, if you look at the entire tech industry, from, the early days of even finding a common print driver to use a shared printer, to getting to a point where you can share, files, to the message, to the example that Mirko gave, in terms of sending emails. I think, we have become, much more of an interconnected world globally. And industry change requires a level of interoperability, a level of interconnectedness that is seamless. It also requires, economic incentives that, continue to fuel the innovation. So we're not, saying everything has to become, disincentivized commercially, but on the contrary, it's more, by really driving, customer value through interoperability, through choice. We can deliver higher value use cases by working across deeper areas of specialization by different providers across the world and with customers. And that is core. That is core to why we joined the Open Voice Network, because voice is a key modality in how, consumers, businesses, and people are going to interact with technology going forward. Voice is a modality that lowers the barrier of access to any complex technology by abstracting everything behind it. Look at modern day cars. They are computers on wheels. They're very sophisticated. They're very complex. Automotives are struggling sometimes to sell to a different generation of demographic because there is a tech phobia. They just can't operate the car. It's just so complex. And one of the ways you overcome that is through a voice modality, because if you can, communicate with the car, if you can communicate with a modern electronics device, clearly that lowers the barrier. It's also an incentive to sell more. So that's why I emphasize that change happens when, commercial incentives are aligned. If you look at the examples also Mirko kind of gave, commerce is critical. And, we also live in a very diverse world. There is not going to be just one provider of everything or anything. There's always going to be a diversity of innovation, and that's a good thing. We encourage that. And that diversity requires a level of, again, interoperability. And there's a lot of, very good academic, work that's also been referenced by the, Open Voice Network. But I think, driving thought leadership in this domain is foundational, because when you have the thought leadership, when you have the incentives, and when you have the need, or the pain for change, then, change happens. The last thing I'll say is, we have been, as a company, a fundamental supporter of, privacy. Satya, our CEO, calls privacy a human right. We have been a fundamental supporter of responsible AI and ethics. We were actually the leader in providing the early frameworks on how AI could drive harm. And we have been a fundamental supporter of, trust and not competing with our customers and our partners in terms of just the use of data. And that data belongs to customers, and that business models should not be competing between providers and customers. And I think the work here plays to that really, really well. And it's very important because we want to be able to establish trust connections in the history of civilization, its civilizations progressed and commerce expanded based on trust. But trust requires a certain level of, also verification and a certain level of, foundational pieces. Those come together when you have standards, when you have ways of people communicating that are aligned from an incentive point of view, and that respect the compliance aspects of it. And I think this is kind of why this work becomes so critical in at least having the conversation and at least educating people, which is kind of my last thought. Technology always is probably a decade or more ahead of laws and regulations. We've seen that throughout the entire history of tech, and I think policymakers and decision makers and legislative bodies are well intentioned. The challenge is just educating them, giving a perspective, providing alternatives, and then helping them catch up to where the tech is heading, and vice versa. So I think this work is builds upon that as well, foundationally, and I strongly thank you for the amazing work. I know volunteer work is never easy, but it's incredible to see this level of passion and work come together. So with that, really appreciate the time.
Ali, thank you. Just a final question quickly for Mirko and Ali. What are you looking for going forward? No doubt from your perspective on the board, go faster, deeper. Is there a message you'd give to the participants in this call? Mirko, please.
Yeah, so as Ali mentioned, I mean, we really honor the work of volunteers, and we see the effort and the passion you put into. But in the end, it will only work if we really get something on the road. So this is my ask, my wish for the future, that we really be able to present something to the public, which then also get adopted. Because I guess I hope this is what we all are here for, that we really something out in the field and not just working on papers, but really see it in practice.
Ali?
Yeah, I mean, I could not have said it better than Mirko. I think, I always advocate for, being very principled, but also being very pragmatic. I think we live in a world where if we try to solve, broader issues, and we're trying to solve them in a way that, could potentially be misaligned with the reality of the industry and the ecosystems and the incentives, we can burn a lot of calories doing that. But that's kind of why we do partner with academics that have that luxury. So that's fine, but I think from a pragmatic point of view and what, can move the needle, is kind of really what Mirko said. It needs to become pragmatic. It needs to become real. It has to have traction within the realms of, how commerce works and how policy and legislative bodies work. And I would also add that, given Mirko is based, out of Europe, has to work globally. This cannot be just a US point of view of the world. As much as we would like, to think that we could, lead on every front, that is just, I don't think that's respectful. I think that is just a fallacy. And I think that, there's so much innovation happening around the world, in Europe and Asia. There are a variety and a diversity of laws, and we should celebrate that diversity because it helps us become all better. So just echoing what Mirko said, go faster, go quicker, be pragmatic, get something out there, fail fast, it's okay, but let's get something that we can have a conversation around and incrementally improve.
Ali, Mirko, thank you. And with that theme of pragmatism and moving fast leads us to our next speaker. And let's talk about being pragmatic and getting stuff done. Let's turn now to, next slide, please, to Dr. Debbie Dahl. She's a principal with Conversational Technologies, serving as a senior advisor and technical editor of the Open Voice Network. Let's talk, and Debbie, take us through the very pragmatic getting stuff done and moving to tangible outcomes, the interoperability roadmap of the Open Voice Network. Debbie?
Thank you, John. I am very happy to be talking about this practical details of how we're going to be moving forward on our specs and standards. I think the first group of speakers did a fantastic job of showing the vision and and the reason that we're all doing all of this. And now I'd like to move into the next level of detail about how we're actually going to accomplish it. So can we go to the next slide? So we've divided our group work into 4 different major activities. And some of you may be familiar with these, but I'll go over them quickly. Architecture is our main area where we're talking about how are these interoperable conversational agents actually going to talk to each other. And in the presentation after mine, we'll see a lot more detail about our progress toward this goal. The second major activity is destination and location. So these interoperable conversational agents are great. They're out there talking to each other. How do they find each other in a way that's similar to the way that websites find each other? If we need a conversational agent with a certain kind of capability, where is it? How do we talk to it? How do we establish a connection? Our next major activity is privacy, which we talked about several times earlier. We need to be able to protect individual and commercial data and voice applications. And when we have interoperable agents, they're not enclosed in a silo. We have to really respect that data as it passes between agents. And finally, our last area has to do with security and authentication. These are the steps that organizational security officers have to take to make sure that security is respected in voice technology. And finally, another interesting area that we're working on is the idea of how do we know if a voice is synthetic or it's been spoofed, which could have some repercussions if we don't detect that kind of problem. So let's move on to the next slide. So these areas are all interoperating. They have some concerns that are unique to their particular area, but there's also there's a lot of overlap with the architecture work, because these concerns, privacy, security, and authentication, and destination and location, all have impacts on architecture. So we can go to the next slide. So these are some of the documents that we are planning with between groups. So privacy is integrated with architecture in a couple of upcoming documents that'll be published in the next few months. The destination and location services are also, that's going to need to be very closely integrated with architecture. And we have a couple of documents that we'll be publishing in the next couple of months. And our final integration is between security and authentication with architecture. And we have a couple of new documents coming up for the end of this year and the first quarter of 2023. We'll be talking about those overlapping concerns. So we could go to the next slide. This is going to be our detailed roadmap. It's very busy. I apologize for that. It shows our four tracks and also our outreach activities. So the green boxes are all of the architecture publications. Some of them have already been published. 3 are already published, and we'll talk about a couple of these are just published. We'll talk about those later. And then toward the end of 22 and the first quarter of 2023, we'll be publishing our integration perspectives between architecture and the other activities. Similarly, our privacy work, the blue boxes, they're going to be published toward the end of December, and they'll feed into the architecture work at the beginning of, or the end of January. Destination and location services will also feed into the architecture work at the end of January. And the security work will start to be integrated with the architecture work toward the end of March 2023. So we have all of these areas that we're working on. They're folding into each other to have a total picture of how everything is going to interoperate. So we can move on to the next slide. So these are the work that I just talked about has to do with developing our specifications and our guidelines, but we also have a concern in two other important areas, standards. So there are a lot of standards bodies that have perspectives on voice applications. There's, for example, the World Wide Web Consortium, the IEEE, the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, and ISO. There's actually many standards bodies, but we'll be reviewing the possible standards bodies that we might want to work with and decide how they, if their purview has to do with voice in any way. We'll be looking closely at those and submitting our specifications to those standard bodies for consideration to become official formal standards. And similarly, the other kind of beyond specifications work that we're planning to do is it's been referred to earlier as developing software. So we are not expecting to develop the ultimate interoperable software, but what we do think that we can do is develop software that can probably inspire an ecosystem of developers who are excited by our specifications and by the possibilities of interoperability that our specifications illustrate. We want to kind of kickstart that activity by showing that, yes, there is the software that we're developing or the specifications that we're developing can be realized in actual software, open source software that would be part of the Linux Foundation suite of open source applications. Our software will first demonstrate the specifications, and it'll kind of feed back and forth in a virtuous cycle of, we'll test out the specifications with software, we'll decide what needs to change that would make the specifications better. And as time goes on, we should be doing some outreach to developers who can also participate in this work. And our initial software will be demonstrations and proofs of concept, but as the specifications mature, we'll be growing into reference systems that other people can build on. So we can go to the next slide then. So the previous architecture publication, I want to just review what we've published so far. It's called the Interoperability of Conversational Assistance, a New Approach. It was published on August 12th, and it gives us, some of you may have read it, but if not, I'll summarize it quickly. It's a broad perspective on the OVON vision for interoperability, and it focuses on, at a high level, on the patterns of communication among assistants. It identifies the architectural elements required for interoperability and prioritizes these elements for standardization. We intended for it to also foster discussions among members of the conversational AI community, including the enterprise content creators and communicators, stakeholders, and decision makers in the voice technology industry, and the current and prospective participants and sponsors of the Open Voice Network. And I think we've achieved some of that discussion because we asked for comments from the community. We got 60 comments. And let's go to the next slide. The 60 comments that we got from the public on our first document were added to a new document, the version 1.1, which we published last week. And so that's out there for anyone to review. It is basically an update of the 1.0 with a lot of very valuable clarifications that we received from our public comments. The second publication that I want to talk about is our very exciting one. It was published yesterday, and you're really the first people to get a look at it. We'll see a lot more about that in Bruce's presentation, which will it'll follow mine. It's called Interoperability Architecture Patterns, Initial Thoughts. And we're getting much more into the level of detail of how do these interoperable conversational agents actually communicate. There's a URL for it, which you can also just find by looking at the openvoicenetwork.org website. And you should also have gotten a link in the email announcing this workshop. We have a public mailing list at whitepapers at list.openvoicenetwork.org, and we'd be happy to hear from you and on that mailing list about any comments that you might have. So we can go to the next slide. So I want to encourage you to help us shape the future of conversational AI, because that is really what we're doing here. We're going to go beyond silos, develop an interoperable voice web. And how can you help? There's two ways. Certainly providing your wisdom. You can read the papers that we've published, send us your comments, just talk to us, and we'll have actually some opportunities for you to contact some of us later on. And the second one, and even more exciting, is where we would love to have people join our teams. There's a lot of work to be done. You saw the roadmap. There's a lot of documents we need to work on, and some of these documents address some really hard questions of how do we develop specifications that are not too broad, not too narrow, and specifications that will actually realize our vision of the interoperable voice web. We can use some help developing requirements, developing the software, and developing the specifications. So please keep this in mind as you listen to the rest of our discussions, and hopefully you can see some places where you could contribute your expertise. You can go on to the next slide. So, as I said, the next presentation is going to be a just overview of our new document that was published yesterday, discussing the different ways that conversational agents can cooperate. Our primary authors are David Attwater, who's a senior research scientist at TalkMap, Bruce Epstein, who's a knowledge transfer wizard at AEBIS, and Boris Volfson, who is a principal UX designer at Nuance. And they would also, I'm sure they would also acknowledge that there were there's a lot of contributions from the architecture working group, but these are the main authors. Our main speaker will be Bruce Epstein. So, Bruce.
Thank you, Debbie. Yes, indeed. As you've said, this is a team effort. And while I'm representing the architecture work group, this could not have been possible without their contribution. And in particular, I'd like to thank David and Boris as the co-authors, without whom this presentation would not be nearly as thorough and insightful as it is. Next, Nathan. So the focus here is on the what and how of interoperability and cooperation. So I will start with our operational definition of interoperability, which is in the white paper that Debbie referenced. A few of the characteristics of what we observe in conversational agents, a few words about in the context in which these agents will cooperate. And then the bulk of the presentation will be illustration of a few modes of cooperation and interaction between agents. And we invite your discussion. Please put comments or questions in the chat. There will be time at the end of this particular section for answering those questions and obtaining your reactions and your feedback. So please let us know. Nathan, next, please. So our operational definition of interoperability, and as was presented earlier this morning, we are envisioning voice systems that operate like the web. So in that perspective, interoperability for voice components in a voice system, and I'm sorry that there's so many words on the slide, I will try to summarize, but there are two parts. One part is what the user sees. So the user sees the ability of a set of conversational assistants that may have been provided by different providers operating with different technology, and these assistants collaborate seamlessly to accomplish the goal that the user is expecting. Sharing information with the trust that John alluded to earlier, and independent from the physical devices that are being used. And we know that there are a wide variety of physical devices, and those are increasing as, for example, IoT devices become voice-enabled. And then the second half is from the perspective of the content providers, the service providers. So it's the ability of those providers to reach their audiences, irrespective of the diversity of platforms, assistants, and again, physical devices, which in our language we're calling endpoints. These are complementary goals, and both are necessary to reach the vision that we have set out within the Open Voice Network of voice systems worthy of trust. Thank you. Next slide, please. So what are the characteristics that we are setting out for a conversational agent? And first of all, just to say that we're using words interchangeably, agent or assistant. Those are synonyms for the moment. They are conversational components that interact using natural language. This could be spoken natural language, written natural language, and it could be a variety of natural languages, as we've already said. This is an international environment. A conversational agent has an identity. It is unique and uniquely identified. It may have a name, and some of the more popular ones, I don't need to use their names, but you know who they are. And in some cases, they may have a pronoun associated with them. These are not part of our standards, but this is what we've observed in the market. The third characteristic, and this is of utmost importance, is that a conversational agent has boundaries. It has a set of functions, capabilities for which it is designed and for which it is uniquely qualified to perform, but it's not performing every possible function that's imaginable. It also has boundaries in time and in scope. It only knows about the conversations in which it has participated unless additional context has been provided by other agents in the system. And thirdly, it has a private representation of its own knowledge, its own dialogue, its own functionality. The goal is to create an environment in which conversational agents act to the user as if they were a human, a person, with the same level of predictability, the same level of trust, and the same level of boundaries. Next slide, please. So remembering that we've now defined agents as having boundaries, these boundaries enable useful cooperation, and they're useful for the humans who are the central part of this system. So humans deal well when they know what they can expect, and they can recognize the knowledge and the capabilities associated with each actor in the system. They're also useful for the creators. This allows the creators to create or to establish branding, for example, protecting intellectual property. This has economic benefits in a cooperative mode. We'll see that in a moment as well. And it improves security. Next. We believe, and we have seen this in the examples that were cited earlier, monoculture is not our goal. It stifles creativity. It introduces barriers instead of encouraging cooperation. Diversity, in our view, is empowering for both the users and the content providers. Agents will not all be the same. Some will be highly specific with very rigorous security and quality goals. So, for example, think of your bank assistant. Other agents may be very rudimentary: home appliances, smart home components, the dashboard of an automobile, for example. Innovation, we believe, is encouraged and promoted when barriers are eliminated, and everybody should benefit economically. Next, please. Next slide, please. So given this, we have identified 4 modes of cooperation. We don't know if we've identified all of them. We invite your feedback. If you know of others that exist or that are desirable that we haven't identified here, and we will illustrate these. So these 4, and the names are tentative. These are not normalized names. These are just the names that we have been able to identify at this point. If there are better names, we're more than happy to discuss what we should name these. So the first mode we call native. That is a mode where an agent performs a task without cooperating with any other agents. And there are actually 2 subcategories of native execution. One is the beneficial mode, where we have an agent designed to do one task and it performs that task. It doesn't need to call upon any others to complete that task. And that's great. The other is the mode that we're trying to migrate away from, which is the walled garden, general purpose. One agent does everything without cooperation. We're not going to discuss that here, but that is the mode that we are trying to migrate away from. The second mode, which we're calling channeled, one agent acts as a relay, speaks for a second agent. And we'll see that there may be examples, maybe reasons why that's useful. The third mode we're calling delegated. An agent recognizes that it can't perform a certain task, and it hands off the execution to a second agent. And then the third mode we call mediated. The agent acts on behalf of the user, conducts a conversation with a second agent, and then returns the result to the user. We will be demonstrating the next three using an illustration around a very simple request, the user asking for a weather forecast. So next slide, please, Nathan. So in a channeled, agent A is acting as a relay here between the user and agent B. Now, in the example, you're not seeing any difference, but in a real life situation, agent A could, for example, be translating between one natural language and another, or be providing a voice-enabled interface to an agent that doesn't have that capability. And please forgive us. This is, I'm sure I had corrected this. That agent A passes the request to agent B, receives answers, and passes them back to the user, not to agent A. Okay, next slide, please. In a delegated situation, agent A receives a request, recognizes that it's outside its scope, and passes execution then on to agent B, which then conducts the remainder of the dialogue with the user, providing the final result. At the end of the dialogue, agent B is now in control, or could yield that control back to some other agent, and that is a system design issue that is outside of our standards purview at the moment. Again, we will be discussing what the scope of our standards are as well. But in this case, so agent B is in control at the end, and then we'll make a decision about where the dialogue goes after that. Next slide, please, Nathan. So the third case in mediation, agent A reformulates the request, conducts a dialogue with agent B, and then at the end provides a single answer back to the user. Now, the interesting thing about this case, and I'm not going to name the demonstration, but I suspect many of you may have seen it as well, agent B might actually be a human, and agent A could actually be imitating a human and conducting this conversation. But for purposes of our demonstration here, it actually doesn't matter. The case here is agent A is acting on behalf of the user and remains in full control of the dialogue. Now, I know I've gone through these very quickly. There will be a moment for questions and discussion just afterwards. So again, to echo what Debbie said, next slide, please, Nathan. We welcome your help. Provide us feedback. This is all, everything that I've just presented now was extracted directly from the white paper that was just released. Please review it. Please provide your feedback, your suggestions, your enhancements, your discussion. Tell us where we need to go with this next. Join our working groups. We meet weekly on each of the topics that were presented just before that. This in particular, this is the Interoperability Architecture Working Group. There's also privacy, there's also location, there's also security. We need sponsorship as well, sponsorship, both financial and market sponsorship. Please contact John Stine if you are interested in helping us in that way. contribute to our crowdfunding, become a friend. Those of us who are volunteers, and I'm a volunteer, we are friends of the Open Voice Network. There are benefits of being friends. You can go to the website and see all of that. And at this point, I'd like to open the floor. Have there been any questions that have been raised?
Thank you, Bruce. Alan Furstenberg, you had some questions. Did we get your question solved? Alan Furstenberg.
Sorry, I needed to find the microphone. I think, I guess I feel like my concern is the one that's raised there, is that you're presenting a framework, a set of definitions, and then you're coming up, then you have these models which suggest things about your definition that don't make any sense. Or sorry, that's overstating it a bit. I apologize. That seem to contradict in some ways some of your definitions. So, for example, while it's the characteristics of a conversational agent, you talk about how it has identity, and yet in a model that is channeled, that doesn't necessarily have that identity. You don't need that identity. In fact, the identity becomes a hindrance. None of the model, and I need to look at the paper, but I would hope that the paper talks about how the pluses and minuses of the boundaries that are you talk about in the characteristics, how those play through in each of those four models. So I don't think I have an answer. I think I've got more questions. I've got more reading that I need to do. But those are the things that jumped out at me as I'm not understanding right off the bat how those models fit into the characteristics that you have defined. But thank you for the presentation. This is interesting, and I'm glad there's some formalizing about these.
While Bruce tries to answer that question, please type your questions into the chat. We'll try to get to them. Bruce? Actually,
I see Boris volunteering to answer that question. Thank you, Boris.
Sure, I'll try my best. I would say that it's both the identity and the boundary that to me is actually part of the speaks a lot about our approach and our the way we're thinking about solving or helping the problem of cooperation. And in both mediation and delegation and channeling, the thing that stands out to me is the concept or the idea that each agent can, and I'm using this word very loosely, but also not, think for itself and formulate the answer that it wants to give by itself, which means that the way that it owns the information of trying to understand and give out the response is independent of any other agent. So the only thing that the other agents or the other users that listen to the agent care about are the outputs from that specific agent. So the underlying aspect of what we're trying to do is we're trying to find a way for the agents to be able to have as much autonomy as possible, given the constraints of that we want them to be able to interact with the outside environment. It's a little bit of a roundabout way of answering this, but it is very, very important. So the idea of in channeling, in the example that Bruce gave, the agent B was able to formulate an answer that it wanted to formulate. And then agent A, before giving it to the user, could actually modify it again. And kind of the example you could think of, agent A might be speaking a different language, and it could be doing a translation of the answer completely. So it would use a completely different, output from the user perspective, German versus English or something like that.
Nathan, would you be so kind as to move the slide back to the channeled example that Alan so referred to and that Boris is speaking to? Thank you.
And if I could add one more aspect to that, all the dialogue that we're showing here is for illustration only. It is not currently in our scope, nor do we believe it ought to be, to design the particular utterances that are conveyed throughout this example. So it may be very well that agent A, when it reformulates the answer to the user, says, according to agent B, here's the answer, so that the identity of agent B is preserved. That is a systems design and perhaps even a licensing issue that is outside of our current thinking. So I just wanted to be real clear about that. I don't want to mislead just because of the simplicity or the simplification, rather, that we've taken in the illustration. We are not seeking to standardize the content of the utterances, just the fact that they can be communicated in what we see currently as 4 different ways. So, but thank you for your comments. I look forward to seeing a full reaction to the paper as you get a chance to read it. And please let us know. These are exactly the kinds of difficult questions that we need to be confronted with.
Bruce, question about the channel model. If agent A does nothing more than transfer information between B and the user, why doesn't user just directly connect to agent B? Why do we even need agent A in the middle? Is this model really necessary?
Yes, it is. There's a number of cases, and we're already aware of this. This model exists already in the marketplace for a variety of reasons. So, for example, if there's already cases where agent B, for whatever value of agent B you wish, has only text inputs, not voice inputs and outputs. And so agent A might be converting speech to text and text to speech. That's a simple example. A second example, as Boris stated as well, agent B might be speaking a different natural language from the user, and agent A might be performing translation services in addition to any other functionality that it's providing. The third is that agent A might be part of a larger system, and so the user is interacting with this larger system, and then there's just a single piece that needs to be conveyed off to a third agent someplace, and then it's just a simple exchange and comes back. Again, those are all system design considerations. We are not here to condone or sanction any particular type of system design, just to recognize that all of these different considerations and constraints exist. And we want to ensure that interoperability is preserved in all of those situations, some of which may exist in the transition time as well as we make that migration from the walled garden style implementations which is this walled gardens also operate in this channeled mode, by the way. As we migrate away from there, channeled may persist for some length of time until the smart platforms become more interoperable as well. So there are a variety of reasons why this might exist. Again, we are not saying which one is desirable. We're not saying which one should be selected. We're just saying these exist, and therefore we need to ensure that they can function in an interoperable way.
Thank you, Bruce. If there's no more questions, we'll take a quick break. We'll take a break for about 10 minutes, give you a chance to stretch your legs, get a cup of coffee, let the cat in, or do whatever you want to for about 10 minutes. We'll be back in 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Workshop will now resume. I'd like to introduce our next speakers. They are Oita Coleman, who's a senior advisor at the Open Voice Network, and Ed Sewell, who's founder of Velocity AI. Oita, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Jim. In the presentations prior to the break, we discussed the intersections and the dependencies between architecture, privacy, and security. Voice technology brings with it unique privacy and security risks and new threat surfaces that require attention. Next slide, Nathan. Voice communications are rich with information about individual voice owners. Our concern for individuals and organizations is that interacting with conversational AI could increase the stakes for privacy and security concerns. From a data perspective, voice communications are composed of several parts. First, there are the spoken words, which reveal the intent or interest of a user, and the acoustics of the utterance, which can determine first the identity of the speaker, as voice is a biometric identifier similar to a fingerprint. It can also determine the relative physical and mental health of a speaker, as voice can be a biomarker, which provides leading indicators of such conditions as respiratory ailments, Parkinson's disease, strokes, and schizophrenia. Lastly, the emotional state of the speaker. Is the speaker anxious, angry, or depressed? Can the speaker be trusted? Are they believable? In addition, through the analysis of both word choice and acoustics and the use of large data models, voice data analysis can make relatively accurate inferences as to a speaker's gender, ethnicity, educational and income level, and geographical location. Next slide. The protection and security of voice data are not only the basis for user trust, but also for innovation, sustainable growth, and profitability, which leads to the question of who owns voice data? This is a very important question. And to paraphrase a popular aphorism, whoever has the data makes the rules. We assert that the creator of data is the owner of that data until there is explicit consent to the transfer of ownership. The owner is either an individual creating data through a voice utterance, or it can be an organization represented through the persona of a conversational agent. And individuals' voice data is personal information. We noted previously the important biometrics and biomarkers, as well as the utterances which may contain personally identifiable information. All of these are subject to personal information laws and regulations. To restate what Chris said earlier, your data is your data and is your choice to share. And I also want to highlight what Ali said as he stressed Microsoft's point of view that privacy is a human right. And John stressed that voice is an emerging and evolving technology, which means that standards will need to emerge and evolve with it. Existing global frameworks cover some aspects of data protection, but voice-specific regulations and legislation are lacking. We assert the need for standards to protect individual voice data and organizational interaction data to earn trust. Ed, could you please share how the Open Voice Network proposes that we address these concerns?
Yes, Oita, absolutely. If we could move to the next slide, please. And so as we talk about the trust factor, voice worthy of user trust, John Stine did an excellent job. It's very eloquent in the way he expressed that trust goes beyond just data privacy and data security. Although those two components are key components, now we're talking trust in individuals and trust in organizations. So if we go back to talk about the economic and the societal value of data, that value proposition, there's a lot of trust that needs to be in place between data owners. So for example, if we're asserting that your data is your data that has a monetary value to it, but also it has a societal value to it. For example, as Oita expressed, it can help in healthcare for early diagnosis of diseases like Parkinson's and others, or it can help in mental health conditions. It has many different use cases and value in society and to us as individuals, but it also has an economic value to society and to companies and organizations. For example, enterprises can use the data in order to create better user experiences, or they can use the data for monetization purposes to better understand what your needs are from a commerce perspective. Governments can use the data that's derived from voice to deliver better services, governmental services. For example, in India, it's called the Attwater system that's used as an identity system that now is linked to government services in order to more efficiently provide various services to their citizens. So there's a lot of use cases, and it's a lot of value from an economic and societal perspective. But in order to achieve that value, we need to have trust in place, and we also have to have trust mechanisms in place as it relates to data security and data privacy. And again, going back to Ali's point and Mirko's point in the value of standards, standard ways of using voice identity and authentication within the marketplace, we believe will accelerate economic growth for everyone. So as it relates to the Open Voice Network Security Standards recommendations, we published a white paper just a few months ago, and then we had a webinar that asserted 2 new security standards specific to voice. The first is secure voice identification of human users and conversational agents, and the second is secure multi-conversational agent data sharing. So starting with secure voice identification, what makes voice different than other biometric modalities is the audio, content, and acoustical elements of voice, meaning your voice can be heard by other individuals, but it also can be heard and inferred to derive different insights, as we talked about, the richness of the data set by other AI agents. The second part is when we talk about identification and access, we're referring to access to physical world and also the virtual world, or the term that is being used today, the metaverse. So one of the emerging risks is the fraudulent use of synthetic voice data in order to bypass identity and authentication systems. And so we think of a world that has a metaverse or immersive experience. That voice may sound like a human voice to an individual, but it may not be. It may be an avatar mimicking a human voice in order to commit fraud or other types of unlawful acts. And so that's why we've asserted the need for voice identification of human users and conversational agents. The second is secure multi-conversational agent data sharing. So we think of a world of the worldwide voice web where our voices are the primary interface into the physical and the virtual world. So, for example, we have consumer smartphone devices, whether that's an iPhone or Android-based or a Windows-based device, just for examples, that can, today, we can use our voice to unlock the phone. So that's not innovative at this point. To move the industry forward, how can we use our voice as that primary secure interface into the physical and virtual worlds? But also, how do we interact with agents on our smart devices? For example, how can I now use my smart device to ask my conversational agent to go book a hotel for me, or go book a flight, or make a doctor's appointment, or interact with my car? As Ali said, it's a computer or an AI with wheels. How do I use my voice now to interact with avatars within the metaverse? This is where secure multi-conversational agent data sharing comes into place, allowing multiple agents to be able to interact and communicate with one another and share data securely. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. In order to enable this world that we see and to make it tangible, not 10 years from now, not a decade from now, but today and moving into tomorrow, we need a reference architecture to support this level of innovation. So I'll go back to the example of the smartphone that's enabled by intelligent, we're referring to as host agents. So back to that example that now I can use my smartphone to interact and perform different acts on my behalf, like book a hotel, book a flight, make a doctor's appointment, just as a few rudimentary examples. And so what we've proposed is to accelerate this work and to demonstrate that value is creating a voice authentication standard and protocols that are controlled by the individual consumer. So now that the consumer has control over their device, over their agents, and has built-in data protection. So for example, the way voice authentication works today, or other modes of biometrics with usernames and passwords as well, those credentials are stored in a remote server, typically in a cloud-based server. So you may have access to identities and credentials on thousands and maybe even millions of persons, which perpetuates what's called phishing, where those credentials can be stolen from that remote server. In this reference architecture, along with FIDO and W3C, now your credential can be stored on your smart device. So now you have built-in protection through your smart device and the semiconductors within your smart device in order to protect your voice biometric data. And so your keys are private to you. And now you also have a public key, which is through the delegate agents that allow you to use the private key and the public key in order to interact with multiple services online and within the physical world. The second part of the reference architecture has to deal with having multiple ways to, or multiple levels of security. So once you're registered, you're identified, we know that it's a real human being and not a synthetic voice. It's attestation, so that we have another level that verifies the device. Then we have voice authorization, similar to the way credit cards work today. And now you can authorize what data you as a consumer or you as an enterprise want to share. So the other point that I want to make as far as the velocity reference architecture and integrated with the Open Voice Network and Linux Foundation standards is that through Velocity, we have access to over 100,000 access points or physical edge locations. And I'm going to repeat that. The Velocity network has global access to over 100,000 edge locations. Okay, what that means is if we want to set up infrastructure to test voice interaction with the vehicle in Germany, we can do that. If we want to test smart homes, smart communities in Atlanta, Georgia, we have access. We can start that anywhere in the world. So with that, that will help accelerate the work of the Open Voice Network in order to make what we're proposing as standards actionable through a reference implementation of multiple use cases. And what us also support those multiple use cases is that data security component called a data security hub. So each of these are called data security hubs that are co-located in physical edge locations that will keep that data protected so that we can test it and that we have the infrastructure in place to quickly scale. Back to, again, Mirko and Ali's points. Thank you very much. Do we have any questions before I pass on to the next presenter?
Go ahead. Thank you. And let's go ahead and turn to the next slide. And again, colleagues, please be so kind, place your questions in the chat. And again, we'll be addressing them soon in the afterward session, but also within our specific sessions as we did with Bruce and Boris. Let's talk for a bit. And again, this is John Stine, Executive Director of the Open Voice Network. Let's talk for a bit about the how of discovering and finding. And this is a single slide update. Next slide, please, Nathan. Is we started in the Open Voice Network and back 2 years ago, and we saw a need for a DNS-like voice registry system. If indeed we envision voice that works like the web, there might be a voice registry that works somehow like DNS, and maybe there are affiliations with ICANN and others. These were some of the early thoughts that the Open Voice Network had. And a work group was formed and did some very good work, did research, designed, and even demonstrated how an explicit request, take me to this destination, take me from my host agent to a second agent, how would that host agent find the second agent, the delegated agent? And what would be the mechanisms between the two, the contract between the two to make that happen? And indeed, what would be the latency criteria? How fast must that work? Demonstrations were created, some very good work put in place. But recently we took a step back and began, as the work of the interoperability team began working here, the questions expanded beyond a voice registry system. And we realized we needed to address three big questions. How might a user, starting from the host agent, find, and how that host agent would find requested content and services and destinations around the world? Because again, we're thinking not just of hundreds of thousands of, say, applications We're thinking of billions of destinations and websites, billions of destinations within smart home and IoT and smart environments, billions of destinations of AIs. If indeed, as some of our futurists have said, hey, every AI in the future will be conversational, and billions of destinations in whatever the metaverse will be. How do we fulfill an intent? A second is, how might different destinations, content within those, services within those destinations be found? Might there be a standardized way that we could recommend to those who wish to be found, and again, the World Wide Voice Web, ways in which they can be identified or recognized, perhaps registered, perhaps within a service? And then, although certainly there's no misunderstanding that the Open Voice Network is getting into the business of search or discovery, but how might we help, and what would be the role of being finding and being found, the role of data in enabling destinations, content, and services within those destinations to be discovered? What might we recommend? What might be help? And then beneath that, again, as the aperture opened and we realized the questions were larger, how might we enable that? Is there a structure that will need to be set up across all of us? Some neutral, nonprofit structure that enables this? And so we have set, and you saw in the roadmap that Debbie shared, 2023 Open Voice Network objectives in this realm of discovery and finding. And we're using the working term right now, discovery and location services. And you can see those objectives in the blue boxes on the right. In terms of finding, might there be a registry or registries, certainly, distributed registries of destinations? How might that work? What does that look like? What's the structure? Might there be the process and protocols? How do we enable the finding? Once content, services, a destination is identified as a potential destination from a host agent, what's the mechanism? How does that work? And then might there be some standard metadata schemas that would enable destinations, content, services within those to be discovered and to have a better opportunity? And again, working within the realm, working within the realities of the search leaders worldwide. And we know who those are. And then, of course, there will be some governance questions that we'll need to address. This is what's in front of us. This is the high level approach that is going to our technical committee and our board, the steering committee, in recommendations. And we anticipate then in developing another work group, working closely with the interoperability team, as you heard from Bruce and Boris and David, of the, first of all, what are the principles? What is the vision? What do we need to accomplish? And second, from that, what might be the requirements from these? And then those requirements delivered then to interoperability team. We're also in conversation with outside consultants. How might this be done? Where has it been done elsewhere? We're not the first feet that are sitting on the sand here. So taking knowledge from other situations, other areas, talking to consultants and looking to potentially make investments in this area within Q1 2023. And should you have an interest in this, and certainly existing knowledge and expertise in this area, we would welcome those conversations. So again, discovery and finding. Finding, being found, being discovered. Maybe it's a registry, maybe it's some standard metadata schemas, maybe, and certainly it's going to be technical protocols and specifications, and then some governance to support that. As we envision a worldwide voice web of not hundreds of thousands of applications, but of billions of potential destinations. With that, again, please put your questions in the chat. And then let's turn to then our last topic. And Nathan, if you could go to the next slide, please. And Bradley Metrock, I trust you're on the line, and thanks for joining us. We're going to have a conversation here in a little bit. Bradley, as you know, is the CEO of Project Voice, has been one of the founders and creators of the voice community. He is also, and I think this is of great interest here, general partner for Project Voice Capital Partners. And I'm going to be asking Bradley a few questions here, but as we turn to the next slide, what's in front of us? What's next? For the Open Voice Network, and next slide, please. For the Open Voice Network, it's several things. It is the discipline development and addressing the critical questions that have been raised here by Debbie, by Bruce and Boris and David, Oita and Ed, and then here in Discovery and Location Services. A process that goes from what are the principles, what is the vision, what do we want to achieve, and publishing that for the world to see and criticize, to then requirements, to then the discipline development of specifications, which will then lead to testing and revision, and then proposal to the standards bodies that Debbie identified. That's underway, that's happening. And as an organization, we've moved well beyond the storming, forming, and norming phase. This organization is now performing, and I trust you've seen that. A second is those of you who are independent developers and strategists, and there are many of you on the phone who are in that realm. It is working with you to, first of all, listen to your criticisms and concerns, the great questions you're raising, as well as then moving into the testing. Here's a proposal. Here's an idea. Here's a draft specification. Let's test it. Let's move it forward. Oita also alluded to and spoke to the development of the Open Voice Network Trust Mark. It's a concept of self-certification, of here are the ethical principles, the privacy and security principles, and indeed, an independent developer, strategy shop, platform house could say, yes, we do these things. We stand for voice worthy of user trust. And in doing so, we show the Open Voice Network Trust Mark as an example of our commitment to these principles and to turning these principles into action within our company. That's underway. We're also, and many of you who were at the Voice Summit 2022 in Arlington, Virginia recently saw a commitment for the Open Voice Network to raising the critical question of how do we make money with voice? And it's for independent developers and most importantly for enterprises and organizations. Moving beyond maybe the narrow, it's apps in a platform or it's an IVR. And there's much between those 2 points on the continuum. Where and how are enterprises, independent developers and their clients using voice to create tangible, replicable, sustainable value? And the Open Voice Network, working with many others, including the Conversation Design Institute of Amsterdam, to develop educational programs that addresses those questions. Because for voice to be worthy of user trust, those users are going to need to trust that voice will create value, tangible, on the bottom line and the midline value. How can we do this? And so in healthcare, commerce, IoT, smart home, metaverse, gaming, the Open Voice Network is participating in those conversations. And we anticipate working with the likes of Conversation Design Institute, potentially the University of Central Florida and others, some executive education programs coming from the Open Voice Network. But now let's turn to Bradley, and because the Open Voice Network and all of us in this community will need to be guided by and adapting to the industry market transitions. And Bradley, you've been a voice industry leader for many years. You're one of the leaders and creators here. Thanks for joining us. But you're also now, from your perspective as a general partner in Project Voice Capital Partners, you're seeing the growth, where people are investing, where startups are happening, and you're seeing the economic levers of this industry move. Just first of all, tell us, what do you see? What's in front of us is, as we all in the Open Voice Network are working to be guided and adapting to the industry market transitions, chat with us a bit, if you would, the next 2 to 3 years. What's in front of us? What's happening? Bradley?
Yeah, John, I appreciate you inviting me. And, I spent all of last week, fortunately not all of last week, but I was in bed all day Monday of last week, incapacitated with COVID, and then got over it, fortunately quickly, but have had a little bit more time to think about the state of things than maybe normally I would. And it's really fascinating to see all that you do. I appreciate just being able to sit here and, as I have been doing, listening and watching what the group is talking about. I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, on the subject of interoperability, as I sat here and listened to the presentations, I thought about, if you had gone back 5 years ago, when Alexa had come into prominence, Google Assistant was now starting to come out, Google devices, into 2018, the Google devices were showing up. Of course, you had Siri and Bixby also. And there was a lot of chatter at that time about what if we could make these mainstream voice assistants interoperable with each other? Wouldn't that be great? And, I think it would be a really interesting thought exercise to think about if it would have changed anything, if it would have changed a thing. If Siri, if you could talk to Alexa devices through an iPhone, would that have changed the scenario that we're in now, which is that big tech is marginalized and the attitude toward big tech is palpably hostile, giving rise to all sorts of new independent solutions, many of which we see with our fund on a daily basis, new ideas that people are having, all of which is carved out by what has been taken away from big tech. I don't know. It's an interesting question. I think it's the future, but I think it raises a lot of questions in my mind. We're seeing huge, obviously the contact center has been totally transformed by conversational AI. You don't get a job in that domain anymore without having perspectives and opinions and, some sort of working capacity with conversational AI. And what we're seeing right now is the same exact transformation within restaurants. Restaurants are the biggest area that are just, the book is being completely rewritten with how QSR and modern restaurant chains are being operated, with conversational AI being at the forefront of that. So there's a lot of great news going on, but I tell you, there's also a cancer in our midst, which is what's happening with synthetic voice and totally unscrupulous business practices with regards to voices of dead people being cloned as a marketing device. I think it's abysmal. And, if you're asking me for my opinion, which take it for whatever it's worth, the charter for Open Voice Network is to matter. The charter for Open Voice Network, like any quasi-academic thought leadership group, is to matter. And the way that you matter is by kind of having one foot in the academic realm, where you're creating white papers, and you're bringing people together, and you're having valuable conversations, and you're getting on the same page, and you're challenging each other, and you're doing all those sorts of things. But the other foot sits outside of that, and it's interfacing with all of these companies that are doing some of this stuff. A lot of which, with what I'm talking about with this synthetic voice stuff and cloning people without consent, is really putting a black eye on a lot of stuff. And I think it's a question worth asking. If we had total interoperability today across all voice assistants and conversational AI platforms, would it solve the problem of public perception being damaged daily with what's going on with companies, with there being no ethical code around how some of this technology is being used? I don't know the answer to that either. So, I guess all of this rambling, John, is me trying to say, I love what you're doing. I love the call to action on interoperability. I would challenge this group to engage with some of these companies that are doing things that are unsavory, and to engage on this front of consent with how the technology is being used, because there's a lot of media attention to be had there. And that ultimately is how Open Voice Network, I think, brings on more sponsors. I think it brings on more attention by rising up to tackle that issue. So to me, it's all inextricably linked. If you're going to talk about interoperability and you're going to care about that, if you're going to care about how to make money in voice, making money in voice is akin to, if I ask a college senior, what are you going to go do for the rest of your life? And they say, make money. You just slap them. It's like, stop. Making money is the byproduct of being great at something. And Open Voice Network is great at a lot of things. I think that it needs to continue to strive for being uncomfortable. I think groups like this a lot like to be comfortable, and that's sort of where the academic part comes in. It's like to have this comfort zone, this warm bubble. You don't want that. You want constant discomfort. And, John, I leave it to you just to pursue that. And I love what you're doing, but hopefully I'm raising some alarms. I guess I'm not showing up to talk about interoperability directly. I'm instead talking about the things that challenge the existence of everything going on, including interoperability, which to me, I can't get my mind off some of the stuff I'm seeing going on with cloned voices. I think it's heinous.
Bradley, you're raising a number of great points, and Bradley, I think you and I could always talk for several hours on a given topic here, but you challenge the Open Voice Network here, and through the Open Voice Network, the entire voice community. There are the issues of, say, interoperability, but there are the broader societal issues that are first and foremost at the center of trust, of trusting the technology, trusting the use of the technology, trusting that what we say it is, that it truly is. And you've given us a great charge here. Colleagues, I would say that our work in the trust mark, our work in privacy security, and a part of what we've done and are continuing to do in our ethical use task force seeks to address some of what Bradley has challenged us here. But Bradley, it's taken it beyond that. And I think if you've properly made me uncomfortable, and I trust that you've made all of us uncomfortable with your challenge. And thank you for that. Bradley, any final comments and encouragement you'd give to the Open Voice Network here?
I love the work you're doing, John. Somebody's got to do it. It's not easy. You have to keep something in mind. Every company we've seen how these groups work. And over on the digital book world side, which is a different business that we own, we see some standards groups doing some different things with how publications work. And so those groups are a little bit more mature. They've been around a little bit longer because that industry has been around longer. But I can tell you, there's a common thread with all of this, which is that companies want nothing more than to ignore everything you're doing. They want to pay lip service, and they want to say, oh yeah, Open Voice Network, we know them, we sat in on some meetings, and then they want to ignore everything else that you're doing. They want to put you in a box and keep you there. And you have to constantly fight against that. If it were easy, anybody would do it. And we all know you're the exact correct person for the task. It's a challenging, fast moving area of technology. And just look at restaurants. Think about how quickly we've gone from restaurants treating conversational AI like a gimmick, which was 2 years ago at maximum, to now you don't even talk to a restaurant chain without them working on this, for several different reasons. And I don't know, I guess I would leave you with you've got all the right people, you're tackling all the right issues. I would think critically about what the relationship is between interoperability, sponsorship, growth, awareness, and this issue of cloned voices. Because there's if you think about where there's going to be regulation to come with this, probably quicker than anybody imagines, it's going to be that area right there. And it gives Open Voice Network, there's tons of value in being quick, right? And being the first to the field and planting the flag. And if Open Voice Network were able to get even slightly out in front of regulation that's coming that will prohibit companies from mimicking via AI dead people or people where there's not consent, to me, that could be a lot of momentum that carries you a whole long way to do a bunch of other things. And so I don't know. So that's where my mind is at. If you're asking me what I'm seeing, we've all been beneficiaries. We're seeing a decrease in the importance of the mainstream voice assistants by 10x, and that's creating massive fissures where green shoots are popping up and stuff is happening. Restaurants are part of it. Contact centers part of it. But there's a regulation pendulum that's going to swing back the other way. And I just hope that I want to help Open Voice Network do whatever you can to be out in front of that, because that's how John Stine is going to be on CNBC talking about this every other day. That's how Open Voice Network is going to grow 25 times the size of what it is being out in front on that issue over the next 2 to 3 years. So that's what I see, and I'm here to help. I want to, Project Voice is at the disposal of Open Voice Network. It always has been. That is going to be a massive event, which will look nothing like anything we've done before. Media coverage, I think I might have told you, John, the media coverage of Project Voice will be double all previous years combined. There are 4 major publications in the world that cover restaurants, for example. All 4 will be there covering the event. You just tell me what you need, but those are my thoughts.
Bradley, we're going to have to end our session here officially, but first and foremost, thank you for the thoughts, and certainly thank you for the support. And we'll be talking offline on that, but colleagues, a round of thanks to Bradley for his comments. And yes, he's made us uncomfortable, and that was the purpose. Bradley, thank you for doing so and for raising these critical issues. Colleagues, we've come to the formal end of our session. And we're going to move here in a minute to the afterword. A great opportunity. Leslie, I saw some chat. I've seen some comments here and questions, but let's just give ourselves 30 seconds. Thanks to all our speakers and the great presentations here today. And thank you all for being with us. We'll take 30 seconds and then to Jim Larson, and we'll begin our open microphone afterward. Thank you all. This is the Open Voice Network.